and get started. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. I'm so pleased that you're here. My name is Miranda K. Hensley, and I am the chair of the working group that facilitated and edited this Global Perspectives on Information Literacy white paper. And I'm also the past chair of the ACRL Student Learning and Information Literacy Committee. So if you're not familiar with ACRL structure, the Student Learning Committee is one of the 4 goal area committees that supports ACRL's strategic plan, the Plan for Excellence. So I would like to start off by thanking Alan Carberry, a member of our working group that made all of the arrangements for the webinar today. Thanks, Alan. And I'm going to spend the first 10 minutes or so going over how this project came to be and provide you with an overview of the white paper. Then our main speaker, Emma, is going to talk to us about the white paper and her vision for information literacy. And while she's talking, Alan and I are going to gather your comments and questions from the chat box to guide the discussion portion of our time together today. So make sure you put those comments and questions in the box and we'll grab them for you. And then after Emma's talk, I'm going to share some information with you about the upcoming ACRL conference, and then Emma's going to come back and we're going to chat all together. We should finish it on time at the top of the hour. Our time together is being recorded today and will be shared widely and openly with anyone who would like to listen, and that includes non-members of ACRL, we're really pleased to say. So it would be really great to get a sense of who's with us today. So if you wouldn't mind putting the name of your institution and your location in the chat box, that would be real great. All right, so when I was at the LILAC conference in Newcastle, England in 2015, I found myself during a tea break talking to my librarian crush. And my librarian crush is Emma Coonan. And if you don't know Emma, her and her colleague, James Becker, who also served on our working group and is one of our white paper authors, designed a new curriculum for information literacy, which is often referred to as ANSL. And if you haven't heard of this, I'm going to stick this in the chat box for you so you can take a look. There you go. And to give you a sense for how influential this work was, we used ANSL as inspiration during the development of the new ACRL framework. So anyway, Emma and I were there. It was a beautiful spring day. We were talking about teacher identity, and I felt this connection to Emma. And I think we've all had this moment when we meet someone that we jive with right away, somebody who challenges us to think about new things, new perspectives. And I thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. And it occurred to me that this happened to me every time I had the opportunity to travel to an international conference, that I had been challenged to think about information literacy in ways that I had never thought about previously. So at that point in time, I had been lucky enough to attend a couple of LILAC conferences. I had also attended WILU, which is similar to LOEX. It's held in Canada each spring. I had attended COLIS, which is a Library and Information Science conference that's held every 3 years, most recently in 2016 in Sweden. And I had also been to an IFLA satellite conference. And then the other one you should know about is a newly formed European Information Literacy Conference called ESSL, and that will be held in St. Malo, France this fall, and the call for papers is out. And I went ahead and put links to all of those there for you so you can check them out. Anyway, so every time I've been intrigued by the different types of conversation about information literacy that are happening in different parts of the world. And I want to give you an example. So when I went to LILAC in Ireland in 2010, everyone was talking about how workplace readiness could be supported through information literacy curriculum. And I hadn't heard any discussion about that here in the US. At that point in time. If I recall correctly, we were actually consumed with talking about LibGuides a lot at that point. So the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there weren't very many of my colleagues at international conferences. We've all had our travel funding cut. Mine was cut at Illinois just this year. But I also don't hear our colleagues referring to information literacy work from other countries in presentations. I'm not seeing it cited in papers either. So that's one of the reasons why this idea came to be. I have a couple folks here that have inspired me over time. I'm going to stick those in the chat box for you as well. So as the chair of student learning in 2015, we were brainstorming initiatives to meet our goal as part of the Plan for Excellence, and I brought this idea to the group. What are global perspectives of information literacy? And the group decided to construct a white paper, and to do that, we formed a working group. We chose a few people from the Student Learning Committee, Casey Lundstrom from Utah State, Nicole Brown from NYU, Rhonda Heisman from Marian University. She is the current chair of student learning. Alan Carberry as well from Champlain College. He is also one of the keynote speakers at the LILAC conference in a couple of weeks. And then we picked a couple people that are outside the structure of the Student Learning Committee. The current instruction section chair, who at that point was Elisa Kahoy from Penn State, and Jane Secker. I mentioned her role in the white paper and on the group, but she is also the chair of the Information Literacy Group for SLILC. SLILC is the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals. It's kind of like our ALA in the UK. And then most of you will be familiar with Sharon Mader in her visiting role, visiting program officer for information literacy at ACRL, which her term just expired. She just finished that job, but she is also the chair of the IFLA Information Literacy section. And while I'm on my thank yous, I just have a couple more. We have two ACRL board liaisons throughout this process, Julie Garrison and Caroline Fuchs. And then we are indebted to Mary Jane Petrowski at ACRL. She's been amazing and helped us through this process. So if you are thinking about doing something like this in the future, there's lots of great people to help you through. All right, so our group had several conversations about information literacy. We talked about what does global mean, what is information literacy, but also how is higher education structured outside the US, how is that impacted by information literacy, what trends are there in IL theory and practice. I remember a conversation that we had about trying to figure out regions of the world and how we wanted to break that down, and that was a surprisingly difficult conversation to have. But what we ended up doing is pooling our connections with librarians around the world that we had met mostly through conference attendance and international service commitments. And then we did a literature review to see who of our colleagues was writing about information literacy. And we ended up with 18 names. 15 of those names, those people agreed to be part of this project. And as you can see from this slide, we have authors from all over the world that participated, including Southern Africa and Uganda. We had 3 authors from Canada that wrote parallel chapters. They worked together. We have a librarian from Israel and 2 librarians from the United Arab Emirates at their NYU University, Croatia, Norway, UK, New Zealand, Mexico, and then we have an author from New Zealand, Dan Dorner, who actually spent much of his career in Asia and doing research in Asia, and he just retired. This was one of the last projects he did in his career, and we're so pleased he could be part of this project. But the hardest thing about this whole process, the planning process and in reflection, is realizing that there were a lot of other voices that we could have included. So take that for what you will. This is really just a skimming at the top of the surface of this topic here for you. So I want to give you an idea of what the white paper looks like. We gave authors an outline to guide them in writing their chapters. They were each asked to write an introduction about themselves and their role in information literacy, and then they have a choice to choose 2 of 4 prompts. The first prompt was research trends, and we wanted authors to think about what kind of information literacy related research is being done in their region of the world, how that might have impacted their teaching. The second prompt was models of information literacy. So what kinds of standards, frameworks, theories, pedagogy have the authors used to inspire their teaching? The third prompt was about theory and practice, and we wanted them to tell us a little bit about their connection between information literacy and student learning from their own perspective, thinking about their teaching philosophy in some cases. And then the fourth prompt was the role of librarians. So what is the role of librarians in higher education in their region? How did they become trained to be a librarian? What kind of professional development opportunities are there for them? So they had to choose 2 of those 4. And then the final thing that we asked them to talk about is their vision for the future of information literacy for their region. So thinking way out 5 to 10 years, what do they see about IL in their part of the world? And each chapter ended up being about 4,000 words. It's a little bit longer than we had expected in the beginning, but that was fine because it's online and it'll be freely available. And it also, the white paper includes an executive summary and an introduction, and then we did a reflection. We looked at across all of the chapters and talked about themes, thinking broadly about what the connections were between our authors, and I think you'll find that part fascinating to read. So the white paper right now is in final production mode. It's with Erin Nevis at ACRL. It should be out sometime next week, so look for that through all of the regular ACRL channels. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker today. Emma is the Information Skills Librarian at the University of East Anglia and Norwich. She holds a Master of Studies and a PhD in Literary Theory, as well as a Master of Science in Information and Library Management. She also is a fellow on the Higher Education Academy, and her chief research interests, in addition to information literacy, are learning development and the scholarship of teaching and learning, SOTL. And you may have seen that student learning has had some discussions around SOTL through ACRL the past few weeks and coming to as well. In 2011, Emma was seconded to a fellowship at Wolfson College in Cambridge, and that's when she had the opportunity to develop the ANSEL curriculum, a new curriculum for information literacy with Jane. And since then, she has edited 2 books. She's working on a 3rd. I can't wait to read it. And in June 2015, she became the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Information Literacy. And in addition to all of that, she is really well known in the UK. She pens a blog, librariangoddess.wordpress.com, and she graciously agreed to write the foreword for our white paper since she inspired this topic for us, called Towards a Constructive Unbalancing, the Reflexive Turn in Information Literacy. And if you haven't had a chance to read that yet, I'm going to stick that here in the chat box for you. And I am going to go ahead and pass the ball on to Emma, and I will see you in a little bit.
Thank you so much, Miranda. Just before you go, can you confirm you can hear me? And I'm not going to be sitting here talking to myself for an hour? Thank you, everybody. That's very kind of you. Thank you. The first thing that I have to do is clarify, which I always do. My librarian goddess persona was from when I was a student, and it's aspirational, so please don't take it too seriously. It was a huge privilege for me to be asked to author the foreword to this work. And it meant something really amazing, actually. Apart from the privilege of being part of this, it meant that I got to see it. So I have read this, and I have had the fun of pulling out all the bits that are the most meaningful sections to me, all of the best ideas, and the most inspiring trends. And that is what I would like to share with you today. So what you will get from this white paper is, firstly, you're going to get a really important set of snapshots on information literacy from around the world. But what you will also get is a discursive work. It's a beautiful entity. What you've got is a whole bunch of individual works, individual chapters, that seem to be in dialogue with each other. They stand there side by side and they invite comparisons, they invite connections. So, like I say, I've pulled out some of those connections and comparisons, the ones that have, selfishly speaking, the ones that have appealed to me the most from all of this work, and that's what I'm going to discuss with you today. The first one is around the idea of national context for information literacy. So let's move on and talk about context. Yes, there we go. Because what you get in these chapters, each one provides a kind of telescoping of the history of IL development in each country. So you get snapshots and vignettes of the attitudes and the actions around information literacy development. And what's particularly fascinating to me is that it seems to me to mirror, in each case, the movement you can see from the standards to the framework. So from an early focus on definitions, on competencies, ways of getting a marker in the sand for the importance of IL, to get it out there and get some concrete conversation and acknowledgement of it. Once that is in place, you start to see a development towards a kind of complex critical questionings, a more theoretical turn, a more metaphysical turn. So we start to think about what IL is in theory, how we teach it, what its relationship is to learning, its relationship to lifelong learning, and also its connections with power structures. That's something that is talked about a great deal across this white paper and something that appeals to me enormously. I find it a very exciting aspect of IL. It's something that a number of authors have explicitly highlighted, this move away from a kind of pragmatic or instrumental view of information literacy, developing through to a kind of more critically nuanced, questioning, theoretical view. So Torres from Norway, Secker in the UK, and Spiranek from Croatia, they all discuss this overtly. This is part of the theme of their chapters. But you can see the same kind of theme cropping up in all of the chapters, in all of the national contexts. But of course, the recognition and the embedding of this more complex developing vision is at different stages and different places. So you have some other interesting variations in the national context. So for instance, the 3 Bs from Canada, Badka, Bradley, and Berry, all authors whom I've come across before and whom I basically absolutely revere. I was so excited that they're in here. What they each talk about is different aspects of doing IL in Canada from a collaborative, a cooperative point of view. So they all point out there's no national strategy, there's no kind of top-level policy, and yet the way IL has developed in this extremely collaborative way across this enormous country is astonishing. But maybe even more astonishing is Jesus Lau describing the incredible leaps forward at strategic national commitment level in Mexican IL. That is amazing how that has been pushed forward at a strategic level, at the national level. You'll also find in this work, one of the chapters, which is by Dan Dorner, really stresses the importance of cultural contexts in IL education itself. So taking this idea of the differing national contexts and thinking about it in a more applied way. And Dan makes the point that it's incredibly important that we acknowledge that those critical and cultural contexts vary for IL education. We're talking about a situated practice that responds to its context rather than a kind of detached or universal generic set of rules that you can just apply and go, way, job done. So you'll see that Russell and Houlihan, who are writing from Abu Dhabi, are talking about how IL education is working in the Gulf states, and yet it's working within a US educational model because they're on an international branch campus. They're doing transnational education. So they talk in a very interesting way about how they've made adaptations for their local context. Moving on still further to the sociocultural aspect, you'll find that Cara Bradley talks about the role of IL in indigenization of education. My ears pricked up at this. I found this the most fascinating, wonderful thing. What she points out is that there is a growing recognition of the systematic disadvantaging of Canada's Aboriginal population within educational structures. And she makes the point that information literacy is a potential for enabling this recognition, for addressing this problem. But historically, it's also been part of the educational system that operated to disadvantage people. So it historically was part of what shored up an exclusionary educational system. So this opens up some really, really big questions about IL in education and our stance on it. And you will find too, there are similar questions at play in the chapter about South Africa by Raju and Raju. I actually defy you to read this without crying. This is a very, very moving chapter, and it will make real, if it's not real already for you, how important IL is as a function of education. When you read about the legacy of the apartheid system, I defy you not to be moved. I'm going to talk some more about that particular chapter later on. But what I would like you to think about, I'm going to put some kind of questions and provocations in this talk as we go through. And the first one is, I'd like you to think when you get to reading this paper about your own context, your national context. So which of these in the book, in the white paper, what is your own context like? And what impact does that have on your practice? Are you part of a kind of distributed, collaborative, flexible culture with no top-level national strategy? Or are you part of somewhere that has a top-level national strategy that you adhere to? How does it structure your practice? Are there limitations either way? You're part of a big, big movement in IL. So as part of your national kind of identity within that, how does that play out for you? Now, something else that really jumped out at me from many, many chapters in this work is how teaching librarians are seen in all of these cultures. So how we are positioned by others in the academic endeavor. We are teaching librarians within academic circles for the most part, but also how we position ourselves, how we see ourselves. So a number of authors, including Wesigwa, Lau, Russell and Houlihan, also Aharoni, many of them make the point that there are basically just literally not enough trained librarians to deliver the level of IL support that we believe to be necessary. And what some of those authors go on to say is that they feel it needs not only a general LIS or ILS education, it needs something more on top of that to support a reflective, committed teaching professional. And the lack of training for producing those professionals, people who are enabled to teach and to reflect on their pedagogy, is picked up by a number of those authors. This does lead us on to thinking about our identity as teaching librarians, how we see ourselves and what we do as a result of how we see ourselves. I was actually relieved. I was piqued, but I was also relieved to discover that a lot of authors were saying, yeah, you know, how we're seen by our institutions, they are not seeing us particularly as teachers. We are seen as information material custodians. That's Mwesigwa. We're seen as stampers of books, Raju and Raju. So this is an issue which is something that comes up for us in the UK all of the time, the perception of the librarian not as a partner in the teaching process, but as a kind of lovely, fluffy facilitator who buys you nice books. And what we do maybe to move that on has quite a lot to do with how we present ourselves and how we present our professional identities in our contexts. Now this in turn, this comes back to the idea that I mentioned earlier of the distinction between a kind of functional pragmatic agenda for information literacy, which is noted by Sveranek, also Secker, also Torres, and a more critical, open, questioning, challenging agenda for IL. So what you end up with is a kind of a continuum, a spectrum of where your teaching can fall. Are you heading towards a kind of functional, instrumentalist teaching where you can see what you want to produce and you can fit your learners into that? Or is your teaching more about opening up, about uncertainties, about posing questions, about perhaps posing questions to which there are many answers or no obvious answers? Where on the spectrum you are is very, very interesting. And part of how this is influenced is around the content that we get asked to teach. Because what I hear almost everywhere I go is that there's been a shift away in our teaching from a kind of support for finding information, from this rather didactic idea of there's a right way to find information and a right way to deal with it when you found it, towards what in the UK we refer to as an academic literacies point of view, which a number of the authors reference again, which has very much to do with the idea of situated practice, which is around enactments of information literacy that are embodied by the learner and that differ according to different environments. So the academic environment has its own conventions, many tacit, It has its own behaviors that are rewarded. And unpicking and discovering what those are and then embodying them is a complex and difficult practice. It's not something you can kind of train people for. You can only help them to learn it. So we see this coming up in a number of the contributions to this book. So for instance, Berry and Badke both talk explicitly about the role of academic literacies within information literacy teaching. And Badke mentions professors assume that students learn how to do research by doing research. You think maybe we can do something to support them in that? Yes, we think we can. Taurus in Norway foregrounds the connections between teaching academic writing, again, as an intricate, complex, situated practice, and information literacy. And Wang stresses the need for a curricular integration of IL at every level in a really nuanced, responsive way. So not a kind of parallel stream to mainstream academic learning, but something that is integrated, that meshes with it, and that expands the learner's understanding of their context. Something that seems to be a natural development from this opening up in our teaching, this shift in our teaching, is anxiety. We seem to be developing a good deal of anxiety about our identity as teachers as well as librarians. And I think this has to do with the teaching style that we are moving into, this more reflective teaching style, that shift from a didactic kind of approach that says, here's how you do it, and there is an answer, let's help you find it, and towards something that is much more contingent, much more open, much more negotiated, something that has to do with critical states of mind instead of a formula, and critical questioning. And I think very importantly, something that blurs the lines between who owns the knowledge, who's the teacher, and who's the learner. So you can probably imagine now, I want you also to think, as you read this work and as you perhaps discuss today, where does your institution put you on that continuum that runs from a kind of tell people how to find the stuff through to help them to situate themselves and develop an academic identity? Do you have control over your identity as a teacher and how you support your students' development? Or do you have a management culture that says, we spend an awful lot of money on expensive subscriptions, you're going to tell our students they need to use them, right? How much freedom do you have, and where do you place yourself in your teaching on that kind of continuum that runs from quite didactic, maybe collection-focused support through to a kind of academic literacies-inflected learning development? So with those questions in mind too, let's move on. Those questions about our immediate context, about the constraints that we might work under. I want to go back to this concept of socially constructed realities, this idea that's been raised by Dorner, by Lau, by Russell and Houlihan, among others, because I think this is enormously important for our thinking. So the white paper authors see information literacy not only as part of the educational mission, but as a part of personal empowerment. Okay? But also not only a part of personal empowerment, but of actually beginning to understand that there is a power structure at work in all environments, socially, culturally, academically, wherever you look, that there's a default setting that will privilege some voices and will work to silence others. This is what I've called the turn towards critical information literacy. I should say I haven't called it that. This term was in use already, but this is what I've referred to in the foreword as the reflexive turn towards a kind of critical gaze that we bend on our own practice. And this recalls Aaron Swartz saying information is power. Like all power, there are those who want to keep it for themselves. It is an awareness that we're working within structures that have a kind of tension around who gets control, who gets to speak, who they get to speak to, when and how. And several of the authors in the white paper specifically address critical librarianship, critical information literacy, and the implications of this kind of reflexive turn into critical information literacy for social justice. So you'll find Berry, Secker, Spiranek, among several others, discussing this as a tension in our work. Because again, if we're being required to work within quite an instrumental or pragmatic approach to information literacy that perhaps works towards a focus on employability for our graduates, how are we then positioned to start challenging the idea that information is as Spiranek puts it, a neutral, objective, apolitical thing. How can we position ourselves, empower ourselves to do that? If our commitment brings us to a point of view where we say, okay, critical librarianship is a means through which I see the world and a means through which I empower my learners, not just to be learners, but to be citizens, to be individuals. How do we go about negotiating that identity in our context? There is no one answer. You have to do it yourself in your own context. This is a turn that I think is tense, it's demanding, it's challenging to our commitment, it can be scary. But the reason why it matters so much is because education, as Raju and Raju focus or show us, education can function as one of the greatest systems of oppression there is. Here's why. This is a quotation from Raju and Raju talking about education under the apartheid system in South Africa. And this was the feeling that underlay that system. Education must train people in accordance with their opportunities in life, according to the sphere in which they live. I think this shows us really starkly what is at stake here. This is a barrier to social mobility, to self-advancement, to empowerment, possibly even to owning a legitimate identity as a person. And this is a barrier that has been embedded right there in the heart of education. I don't think we can afford to let this happen. So the tension, the anxiety, I think we kind of have to find a way to live with it, because this is what's at stake. If you have a vision of information literacy as not only the foundation of learning, but something that underpins democracy, that promotes social justice, if you believe that access to information and on top of that, the ability to use it, interrogate it, create it, and the freedom to do so is something that humans should have, then that gives us a very clear lead into what we should be doing with our stance. And I think our stance as regards critical librarianship, critical information literacy, I think it's actually of immense importance. The way that we see our own role in this endeavor, I really want us to turn our critical gaze on it, because one of the things that I see an awful lot from librarians is I think I see a feeling that as individuals we can't really do an awful lot. We can't make any difference. Okay? I actually think that modesty is a huge problem for our profession. I think we are a very self-deprecating bunch of people who see ourselves as individuals who can't have a great deal of influence and perhaps don't deserve to have a great deal of influence. What I want to suggest is let's lay that to one side and let's look at ourselves as educators. And if we're prepared to do that, that means we have to accept we already have power within our academic structure. We're already vested with a degree of authority. That means we need to be aware of that power and how we use it. And we need to think hard, each of us individually, about how we can use it best. So let's think about empowerment. How can we be empowered to generate that same empowerment for learners? It seems to me that everything that this white paper says about our approach to teaching, our values, our anxieties, our identity, is that it's not up to us to tell people what is the right thing to do with information or the right way to do stuff with it. The agency is not ours. The agency for information literacy belongs with the learner. And they may do things with information that we didn't mandate, maybe we don't like, but it is their agency. It is their right, but it's also their responsibility to understand and decide not just how to look for the answer, but how to frame insightful questions, questions that might disconcert the existing power structure. Think about information literacy as a state of mind. So not a recipe, not an accessible checklist, but a way of interacting with the world, a way of seeing it, a way of being in it. And what that does for us in our identity is it really means we need to be quite proactive. We need to be thinking about our context, aware of our learners the whole time. We need to be thinking about how to apply, how to enable what we believe will produce information literacy or develop it in our learners, and it's going to be different for each of us. I had a message saying the sound cut out. Can you still hear me? Somebody send me a chat if you can hear me. Oh yeah, thank you, Annette. Recipes, that's where I was at. Our context can sometimes suggest to us that there is a right way to teach and that we should teach according to a kind of recipe in order to foster information literacy appropriately in our learners. And I think what this white paper says all the way through is that we can't do that. We can't sort of take refuge behind a way of doing things that we've inherited or that has been endorsed by someone else. For example, the framework and its dispositions, they're not learning outcomes. They're not the learning outcomes that you should be putting in place for your class. They're a springboard. They're one heck of a springboard, in fact. They are there for you to negotiate, to see whether they are appropriate to apply and how, for your learners to negotiate with you, for them to decide to what extent they're valid, how, when, why. All of this stuff is about the making of meaning with integrity in contexts that we can't foresee right now when we're in the classroom. So we also need to empower ourselves as teachers. And paradoxically, that empowerment actually comes out of a choice that we make to abdicate our authority, the authority that's automatically vested in us as teacher, someone who stands at the top of the classroom right there. If we choose to admit and embrace that we don't know everything, to co-construct learning and viewpoints with our students, to learn from them, to listen to them rather than telling them how it is and how to do it, that's how we empower ourselves. But I want to ask you too, how do you feel about this possibility of being a learner as well as a teacher? Or how do you feel about being a learner instead of a teacher? Again, this is a very challenging set of questions that are implicit in what the white paper authors have written about teaching, about IL, about our practice. The one thing that I will say is I think that if we take the reflexive turn, if we take a critical stance, not just on the world around us, but on our standpoint, our authority, if we start to question our role in teaching and in learning, I think that's a very, very positive thing. In fact, personally, what I believe is that this is perhaps the only way to question your own privilege levels. I think it may be the only way to see your own privilege levels, because that's a bit like trying to look at the back of your own head. To admit a diversity of views, all of which are valid within your classroom, to open up that space where all contributions are welcome, where it's not that you are right because you're the teacher, leads us to a very empowering position. This is bell hooks. Any classroom that employs a holistic model of learning will also be a place where teachers grow and are empowered by the process. I do believe that as we teach our students to question, so we must keep learning to question too, and recognize and honor our role as ongoing learners in a social environment, as well as teachers. But I think those are both difficult identities for many of us to have. I have certainly struggled as a librarian with, have I the right to call myself a teacher? Am I going to be too vulnerable if I call myself a learner with my students? But if you read Hooks, if you read Freire, if you read what the authors in the white paper have written, what you will come away doing is questioning your practice. You will start asking, in Freire's words, am I practicing a pedagogy of liberation? Or am I somehow reinforcing the power structure that dominates and exists already and that works to silence some voices? Am I practicing a pedagogy of liberation? The first time I asked myself that, I thought, oh my God, I sound like the biggest, I don't think I can say what I thought in a webinar, it might offend people. Do I have a right to even use those words? Do I have a right to use the word pedagogy about my practice? I'm a librarian. Can I really sit here and take myself seriously if I talk about my role in the pedagogy of liberation? Somehow, over time, my thinking has shifted. I don't know how this happened. It's shifted from me thinking, do I have a right to even use those words, to thinking I have a responsibility to ask that question of myself. It's not something I can duck. You come away questioning your practice, feeling uncertain, perhaps feeling anxious. But actually, I think that all of those things are very, very positive. They help us to recognize our status as learners, the diversity of viewpoints that others bring in our community, learners, teachers, colleagues, whoever. And they help us to think that there's a possibility we may be mistaken, which is, for me, the kind of ultimate element of being information literate, the capacity to see other viewpoints, be convinced by evidence, and move outside your thinking at the moment. Now, all of this is kind of scary because it means being personally involved. It's quite an anxious way to think. It means that it comes at a cost. All of this reflectivity, all of this engagement, all of this critical questioning of ourselves can be heartbreaking, can be challenging. It blurs something that we think of as very important, the professional persona, the objective self, and the personal, in ways that we might find very stressful. It blurs the idea of neutrality. It calls that very strongly into question. Can we be neutral in a system of dominance which works to promote the voices of some and stifle those of others? If we don't question it, are we supporting it? Is it possible to be neutral? Luckily, they are not questions that you have to try to answer on your own. Certainly lucky for me, because we are learning community. None of us is alone. Sophie Berry writes in her chapter she went to an event and she felt, I have found my people. I think this is very much what I feel. Every time I go to an event, I wish it wasn't just me talking here. I wish I could hear you talk too. I can see the chat coming up, which is lovely. But I wish you could speak synchronously to me, share your views, challenge me, stretch me. Maybe we can start to get towards some of that in the discussion afterwards. I don't know. Something that is written in the reflection at the end of this book is this, which I think is a beautiful thing. We need to learn a lot more, and we can do that together, okay? Because all of these chapters detail a kind of struggle towards a consciousness of structures of power and oppression, of our need to be aware of this default setting, our need to realize the extent of our responsibility as individuals, as information professionals, as educators, to lend our privileged voices in the service of whoever is being silenced, and also to know when to be silent ourselves. I know that's good coming from someone who's just talked for 40 minutes. But teaching is to a huge extent a matter of knowing when to shut up, because learning happens when the teacher stops talking. How do we educate those who are not getting formal education in librarianship? So how soon is it going to happen that we get proper, integrated, formal, critical training in information literacy pedagogy for all teaching librarians, those of us who are on courses at the moment, training, those of us who have been in practice for some years, who need to come back and become reflective again? Do you think that's going to happen anytime soon? Personally, I must admit I'm pessimistic about that. So if that's going to happen, we have to do it ourselves, as a community, for ourselves. We're going to have to find ways to support, to challenge, to provoke, to stretch, and to help teaching librarians, to have all of those things done with us, to us. We're going to have to find ways to help our community get critical and stay critical. And that is so as to enable us to empower others, to speak truth to power, and it's for what they say is the comfort and discomfort of our own profession so that we can continue to develop. We can't just go on being the workhorse, we've got to start being the gadfly too. So I have a couple questions on the next slide. I know I've been throwing questions at you all the way through, but you know, here are the ones that I wanted to finish with. If we have a vision of a learning community that is kind of holistic, that supports itself, what would you need to get out of it? What do you need to practice with integrity? What could you bring to it? What have you got that will help others practice with integrity? So with those questions, I'm going to attempt to hand the ball back over to Mirinda, and she's going to talk to you about some further opportunities to engage with the paper. Okay, let me see if I can do this.
Got it. Thank you, Emma. That was lovely, and I'm overwhelmed. Thank you. So we're going to give Emma a second to have a drink of water and read the questions that were sent to her email. And I'm going to tell you about what's coming up next. So the plan for the white paper, if you joined us a little bit late, the white paper should be out next week. Watch the ACRL channels for that. And I would also like to extend my deepest gratitude to the ACRL Board of Directors. They approved $10,000 in travel funding so that we could invite our authors to attend the ACRL conference. We will have 10 of our authors presenting at a panel and at an open discussion, and both of those events will be held on Thursday, March 23rd, and you can see the information here on the slide. And I do hope that if you are at ACRL that you'll consider joining us. we have, for the panel, everyone will have a chance to speak, and they have been given a couple of questions to think about. And then at the open discussion in the afternoon, again, all the authors will be there, and we will take some of the questions from earlier in the day, as well as some of the things that we've been thinking about through the reflection, and have an open discussion for everyone can participate in that. So I hope that you'll all be able to join us. All right, so Emma, we are going to go to the discussion portion of our time together today. And the first question here that Alan sent that I think is interesting, we should talk about this. Does the international community feel that the new ACRL framework represents a global perspective of information literacy teaching? That comes from Ethan Pullman. And I'll just chime in here, since I was on the task force that wrote the framework. I can say that we did think about international frameworks and guidelines and whatnot, but it did become overwhelming at some point. We are, ACRL is an American association, and so we were very mindful that we were thinking about what US librarians need. But that doesn't mean that what's in there doesn't speak internationally. So what would you like to add to that, Emma?
Am I here? Can you hear me? Hey, fantastic. I'm such a Luddite, seriously. I think what I'd like to add goes back to my point about the frames themselves acting like a springboard. I respond to them very strongly, to all 6 of the frames. I find them provocative. I find them exciting. I find them things that I would want, and I do want, and indeed I do talk to people in my community about. I don't know whether I can speak for any context other than my own. This is always a problem. It's like the kind of trying to see the back of your head again. So I think what the authors are doing extremely well is inviting people to say, how does it work for you? Are you feeling responsive to what we've put forward? Does it work in your context? And I think that inviting authentic responses from many different contexts is how we'll be able to answer that question. I don't think any one person from their own kind of island standpoint, if you like, metaphorically, can say, yes, I confidently believe that these are a kind of global vision of IL. But what I would say from my point of view is they capture things that are points of excitement, points of challenge, about being academic, about communicating within an academic environment. And they resonate, all of them, with what I talk to my students about. I've been, for instance, talking to students for years about Kenneth Burke's metaphor of research. You walk into a parlor, there's a conversation already going on, and if you're smart, you don't just jump in straight away. You listen for a little while, figure out who said what already, and then you join in. And when you leave, you know that conversation is going to be still going on. This is scholarship is conversation. This is, it feeds into researchers' inquiry. They are invitations to think for me. And I hope that goes some way towards answering your question. So it's a weaseling out of saying, no, it's not global for everybody, but it's also an opting in and saying, for me, they are stretching, challenging, exciting questions.
Great, thank you, Emma. Okay, so now I'd like to go to a question from Evan Lynch. He says, how does one abdicate one's authority as a teacher and librarian when working with people from a culture that elevates people who are teachers?
Ethan, that's an amazing question. That's such an important question. What I think is playing out here is a number of identities that are in kind of, oh, this is going to sound so poncy, I'm sorry. There's a number of identities that you need to portray when you are working in any environment, in any community of practice. I think you have to decide where the integrity lies. This is something that everyone has to decide individually. Yes, I do think that it's necessary to portray ourselves as teachers among other teachers, to portray ourselves as partners in the endeavor of learning, and as co-creators in the creation of knowledge. I would never try to downplay that. I spend a huge amount of my time sort of trying to convince, actually, not trying to convince my academic colleagues because they see where I'm coming from, but trying to convince other librarians that they have the right to say that they are teachers, partners in learning, co-creators of knowledge. But when it comes to the classroom, the image that stays with me most often is the image that Parker Palmer uses, where he draws these two diagrams of how knowledge works in the classroom. And the first one is the kind of didactic authoritative one where the teacher is up here at the top and the learners are kind of way down here at the bottom. And the flow of information is unidirectional. It comes from the top down. And his second diagram is that the discipline, the subject, the thing we care about is in the center, and all of us sit around it. And we are equal partners with equally valid viewpoints on that thing that we all care about. The discipline, the subject, the book under discussion this week, what it is we're creating in the lab. And I think there is a way of looking reflectively at teaching that says that is the role of the teacher. Not to be here on top, but an outstanding, a committed, a reflective teacher will want to be that person who sits alongside the class and listens to divergent viewpoints. So again, I hope that makes sense as an answer.
Thanks, Emma. I love how you think things through. It really helps me contextualize really complex ideas. So now I'm going to go to Jackie DaCosta, our friend from the UK, and she has a comment and a piece of a question. So really liked Emma's foreword that was shared online. I've been using it in a paper that I'm currently writing for my university exec on how we would like to embed IL in the curriculum. I've been looking at a variety of policies and framework, but I'm struggling to find an institution, UK preferably, that feels that they've cracked it and their success stories. Wondering if this is down to librarian modesty.
Yeah, I blame librarian modesty for everything, basically. I also think this goes back to context, and it goes back to something that I think almost builds on what I talked about in answer to Ethan's question a moment ago. Part of what characterizes a good teacher is that you don't say, oh, hey, we've hit the plateau, we're there, we can stop. Look at us, everybody, we've cracked it. I think that being in permanent beta, like our systems should be, is part of what characterizes a commitment to IL at institutional level that really works. See, I feel like I'm just weaseling out of all of the answers here today. I think that there is a great need to share practice and actually to do more. I'm going to say trumpet blowing, why not? To say more about, we did this in our institution. We had these KPIs, these indicators of whether we were going to be successful or not. We thought them through and we chose them because these reasons. It's evidence-based. But look, we did it. And look, this is the feedback from students. And this is the feedback from educators. And this is what it has done for us. And yes, you can use it too. So there is a great need for practice sharing that is evidence-based. And we should all be doing a lot more. It's not even congratulating ourselves. It's basically going, hey, we did a thing. Now we're testing to see if that thing works, and the early indications are good. We should be doing much more of that. And again, I want to stress, I think that every institution's context is different. Every set of students in every classroom is different. It's very tempting amongst university senior administrators to think, let's craft a problem, and then let's craft a solution to that problem and put it in place, and then we're done. And I think the most important thing we can do is to find a way to give them product, give them a framework, a strategy, benchmark it against what other institutions do that you've got from sharing practice, but not be prepared to let them close you down. To say, okay, this needs to be evaluated ongoingly. It will change. We will need to adapt. It's permanent beta. Yes, Jackie, does that answer your question? Marinda said I was being clear. I don't feel like I'm being terribly clear at all. It's the end of the day right here for me.
I think you are being clear. Okay, so we still have 5 minutes. So if anybody has questions, please do put them in the chat box. As you can see, I'm monitoring it pretty closely. Our next question comes from Lisa Hinchliffe from the University of Illinois. Much of InfoLit instruction right now is skills training. Should librarians cease their training role, or can we embrace both teacher and trainer identities? I think because you're making the distinction between the two, right?
That is, again, that's a superb question. And it's one that it really speaks to me because the roles that I've held here in the UK, where we have, in England, we have no national strategy on information literacy, although there is one in Wales and Scotland each. But in the UK, a lot of institutions don't have information literacy policies either at work. And neither of the institutions that I've worked in as a professional has actually had a top-level information literacy policy. And they have had quite instrumental approaches, which have forced me into being a trainer. And people talk about me as a trainer. And this has put me in a really difficult position because it would be so much easier for me to advocate for all the criticality, everything that I've been talking about, everything the authors are writing about, if there was a clear and unambiguous identity for me as teacher. But there isn't, because there is a need for me to offer training to people on really complicated systems where I need to say, you click here and then you do this in that way we all love doing. The way that I have come to a partial accommodation of this, okay, it's not a resolution, but the way that I deal with this on a day-to-day basis again is I force myself not to think about them as binary opposites. I think about it again as a continuum. This is the continuum I was talking about earlier, from the kind of, telling people to do stuff up to the inviting them to think about their agency and responsibility with information stuff. How I cope is that with this kind of multiple ambiguous identity, is that some of my classes will fall towards either end of that continuum. While I can see the need remains for training, I'll do it because it needs doing. But every time I have to offer a very functional class, I will offer a reflective section at the end. So students will be asked to think bigger, more widely, about not just the function, the system, the whatever they're doing, but what they're going to use it for now and how they're going to use it. So what will they do with the information they find? Even if I can only shoehorn in 5 minutes at the end of a training session, I will do that because that's the only way I can come to an accommodation with it.
Great, thank you. Okay, one more question real quick, and then I have, I'll just say thank you and goodbye to everyone. But Ethan has one more comment, Ethan Pullman. I think that empowerment and identity cannot effectively exist in a vacuum, in other words, through librarians alone. There needs to be a conversation between educators and librarians to iron out misconceptions about our role. So true. And this is happening in the US, but we are curious to hear what is the international conversation like. Good question, Ethan.
Ooh, I refer you to my previous answer about how I can't really speak for kind of any other context. How it's happening here is, yes, there is an acknowledgement as part of that commitment to a set of values that we have as librarians, as teaching librarians, as educators, that we need to get outside of the library context. Certainly that we don't own information literacy, that it gets called other things by other parts of the university and beyond, that it may be useful to talk about criticality, about developing a questioning approach, about evidence-basedness, and that we have, as part of our reflective responsibility, we have the responsibility to have those conversations, because otherwise, you're absolutely right. It's a great metaphor. You're kind of shouting into a vacuum. You're going, hey, look at me, woo, library. Like, that's going to help. The endeavor of learning, the whole kind of process of creating knowledge is such a massive ask. It's such a big journey. We need everybody on board with this. And although we may call the same thing by different names, sure, let's find out what educational developers call this criticality that we're trying to cultivate. Let's find out what the learning developers, the study skills tutors, the counselors, let's find out what the academics call it. And absolutely, let's not overwrite their structures through which they make sense of this and through which they articulate this need. Let's join in. Let's make a complementarity. Someone just says, Dewey's troublesome knowledge. Yes, yes, I'd go with that.
Thank you, Emma. That is all the time that we have. today. This session was recorded, so we will be sharing it widely. Anybody, not even members of ACRL, anybody can watch this recording, and look for the white paper through the regular channels, hopefully next week. And I would like to extend my most sincere thanks to Emma. Thank you for sharing your truly visionary vision of IL. You are inspiring to me, and thank you for being here and agreeing to write an amazing foreword. I really look forward to hearing other people's thoughts as we begin to absorb the ideas that you shared with us. So I hope to see everyone at ACRL. And thank you for joining us today. And
thank you from me too. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.